Welcome back, everyone. COVID-19 restrictions are lifting in Alberta tomorrow, and that means, once again, a lot of changes as companies and workplaces sort out the best way to move forward.
There won't be a one-size-fits-all solution, and there is sure to be some confusion, anxiety, and the potential for conflict. With more on the rights and responsibilities of employers and employees, we are joined by employment lawyer Karen Tereposky.
Karen, good afternoon. Thanks so much for making time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start with vaccination for employees returning to work? Can an employer require proof of vaccination?
So whether an employer is, if it's appropriate to require that proof of vaccination is largely going to depend on what the purpose is to ask for that information. So if an employer wants that information in order to institute some kind of accommodation, for example, this employee is not vaccinated, should they continue to wear a mask, or, should they continue to work remotely, then, likely that would be considered to be an appropriate question to ask. If the employer is asking that question, with the purpose in mind of penalizing the employee or, disciplining them in some way, then, that's likely not an appropriate question because, there's no requirement for anybody to be vaccinated just yet.
And picking up on that, must employees actually return to a physical workplace? And if so, are employers obligated to make any other kinds of accommodations?
So employers do have the right to ask employees to return to the physical workplace, keeping in mind that that was likely what the job entailed previous to COVID. Because COVID was just a sort of intervening, unusual circumstance, we would revert back to what was the situation before. And if it was working in an office, then yes, or whatever on site. So employees will be required to return if an employer asks them to. And that's subject to, some accommodations if there is some medical condition that would prevent them from doing that. But generally, employers are able to require a physical return to the workplace.
So Karen, in some instances, we're hearing of short staffing in some areas of the economy. Can employees refuse overtime or extended hours?
So employees have to consider what their employment contract says. That's always what we look to see what an employee can refuse to do or what they have to do. And some employees don't have written employment contracts, but there's always at least a verbal one. So, if an employee was required to work those extra hours before COVID and that was agreed to, then, they would have to. But if it was not something that was agreed to previously, then they're within their rights to refuse it. It would just become a favor. And if they did agree to work those extra hours, they should definitely be compensated.
So if an employee has other health concerns, following COVID and going back to work, what are the rights and responsibilities on the part of the employee?
Well, an employee always has the right to have any health concerns accommodated by their employer. So if they have some sort of medical condition that requires certain adjustments to be made or accommodations, they do have that right. Their responsibilities are, to communicate with their employer, to try to come to a proper accommodation and to talk about what that accommodation looks like and to try to get to a place where it works for the employee and the employer.
Just quickly, one more question here. Is it back to a new normal, or is it back to the old rules, or is it a new normal here that we're navigating now?
I guess it depends on the situation. We have to expect that, that was this blip of COVID was a bit of an unusual circumstance. So, is it a new normal? In some ways, we have to expect that COVID shaped the world and shaped our employment laws and practices throughout that time that we, were working subject to it. But in some ways, it's a revert back to the old normal, and in some ways it won't be. So it's the typical lawyer answer of, that I guess depends.
But you identified that for us, and thanks for all of that insight, Karen. It does feel like a bit of a tricky time going forward, so it helps to have some legal insight here. We appreciate your time today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks so much.